What's up guys, welcome back to the channel. In this video we are going to be talking about the Ahsoka series. I'm going to let you know what I thought about this show, what I liked, what I didn't like so much, where I think this story could ultimately lead to, whether I think it was a story worth telling. We're gonna get into it all today, so sit back, relax, and enjoy the video. So I'll start off with just my overall thoughts on this show. I did find it very entertaining. I did enjoy pretty much every episode. I looked forward to those Tuesday nights every week, and they rarely disappointed. And the story overall, when you look at it big picture, episode 1 through 8, is very good. My biggest critique at this point is really just that the finale, while it was a good episode, left a lot to be desired. You know, obviously at this point we assume there's going to be a season 2 of this show, or that they're going to continue this story in the Filoni movie, but we don't know those things for sure because it hasn't been confirmed, and I just kind of wish that they had told us that, or that they would tell us that very soon, because this series was sort of promoted as potentially being like a limited series that would just tell its own story and not need to be continued. But from where I'm standing, they absolutely need to continue this story because a lot of the major plot points were not wrapped up in this season. You know, so much was made of Baylan Skoll's endgame in this series. The entire series really built up to what he was ultimately looking for and hoping to gain by going to Peridea, and we didn't really get an answer to that. Thrawn just made it back to the main galaxy, and obviously that's set up a very big story for the future, and it's something that needs to be addressed, and I'm sure it will be. I just wish we knew how and when it was going to be addressed. Ezra is back in the main galaxy. He just met back up with Hera. What's going to happen with him? What are Ahsoka and Sabine and Shin going to do on Peridea? How long are they going to be there? Obviously, we think these are plot points that are going to be addressed either in a season 2 or in the Filoni movie, or in some capacity, hopefully somewhat soon, but I just wish they would tell us that we're going to have that, because again, season 1 of Ahsoka is not the sort of story that you tell and then you're like, yep, that story's good, let's go tell something else. Like, this story needs to be picked back up because it feels like we're not even in like the middle of it. We're in the beginning of this story, I feel like. So this isn't like a reason to hate on the show for any reason, because again, I think the show overall is good so far. But if the plan is to leave it this open-ended, I think you kind of need to tell fans, hey, this story is going to be continued. This isn't like a one-off thing. Obviously, that's what we assume based on what we saw and based on what we've heard. But I just kind of wish we had a little bit more closure in this series. The finale was very good, but it disappointed me a little bit for that reason, because there are just so many questions on the table still, and I feel like it could be a while, you know, before we get those answers. So yeah, I mean, minor critique, but I do feel like the finale was a little bit too open-ended for me. But let's go ahead and go back to the start of the show. We kick things off with some great character introductions. We meet Baylan Skoll and Shin Hati. The dynamic between these two characters throughout the story is very good. It was one of the highlights of the show for me, for sure. I'm really intrigued to see what happens with each of them from here, and I'm also interested in knowing the backstory between these two characters. I'm not sure that that's something we're going to be told. Potentially, I feel like it could be like a story that pops up in a book at some point or something like that. Obviously, everything that I address here when it comes to Baylan Skoll has the asterisk that Ray Stevenson did pass away earlier this year, so any story that involves Baylan Skoll is going to be done without him at this point. Very unfortunate, but I do expect that because of the build-up and because of how important Baylan's story seemed like it was going to be for the future, they're probably still going to incorporate him into the story in some way, you'd have to think. But I don't know that when it comes to a backstory, we should expect to see anything on screen, maybe through an animated show or something, but I think the most likely scenario would be like through a novel or maybe even a comic. We would get some backstory on Baylan and Shin, but I'm very interested to see, like, what were these characters doing? What was Baylan doing after the fall of the Jedi Order all the way up to this time period in Ahsoka? Did he ever like work with Vader or the Emperor, or was he in hiding like the few surviving Jedi there were, and then he sort of just went on his own path and started training Shin, and they became like this duo that's in the middle of the Jedi and the Sith? They're neither one, and their goals and their motivations are a little more ambiguous than either of those two sides. And that's another thing that, you know, is implied in this series, but it's not necessarily ever clear clarified to the degree that I would have liked it to be, but that's fine because, again, I do think that we can expect this story to be continued relatively soon, not like next year or two, but, at some point in the somewhat near future. And the third component, I guess, to their relationship was obviously Morgan Elsbeth, and I found their relationship with her to be pretty compelling as well, because they each needed each other. Morgan needed them and they needed Morgan, or at least Morgan needed Baylan, to accomplish their mutual goal. But once that goal was accomplished, which was just getting to Peridea, neither one of them really needed each other at that point, so they were kind of expendable. So I found that to be pretty interesting to watch play out. But in terms of the future of Shin and Baylan specifically, obviously, again, we don't know how the future of Baylan Skoll is going to be handled due to the passing of Ray Stevenson, but I'm definitely very interested to see what they do with him, and I'm almost equally as interested to see where Shin's story goes. I mentioned in a previous video that I could see Shin teaming up with Sabine and Ahsoka, and them sort of working together to accomplish a mutual goal, and then just kind of finding out what Baylan Skoll had gone to Peridea for after he's already done it. I still do think that's possible. I could see that happening, but I could also see maybe Baylan being recasted and somebody else playing the role for him, even though I do think that role will be smaller than it was initially intended to be regardless. I could see the paths of all four of those characters eventually crossing and leading to something very big. And then I do think that eventually at least one or two of them is going to get back to the main galaxy. We would hope all three of them, but I also could see Ahsoka potentially staying on Peridea forever. Maybe she sacrifices herself. Maybe she just makes the decision that, hey, I need to stay here because this is where I'm meant to be, and you guys are meant to be back in the main galaxy. And with that in mind, I do also think that a redemption for Shin Hati is likely. Throughout this series, it's been very clear that Shin doesn't really understand what she's fighting for, what Ahsoka and Sabine are fighting for, what Thrawn and Baylan are fighting for. She doesn't really get any of this. She's just kind of doing what she's told. Baylan has given her a sense of belonging. He's sort of maybe like a father figure to her, and so she follows him. And now she's been abandoned by him. And Ahsoka offers to help her in the finale, or maybe the episode before that. And so I definitely think that there's some early build-up and setup for Shin Hati to be redeemed. If I was a betting man, I would bet on her joining up with Ahsoka and Sabine. But let's now transition to the main character, Ahsoka Tano. I think Rosario Dawson does a good job of portraying this character. I know that there's been some fans who have criticized her and said that, maybe she doesn't resemble the character that they knew from the Clone Wars. And first of all, this isn't Ahsoka from the Clone Wars. This is her 30-some years later. This is a very mature version of Ahsoka who's been through a lot and seen a lot and has really come into her own versus the 17-year-old Ahsoka we saw in the Clone Wars, who was still very much trying to find her way. And then on top of that, how often do you see an animated character translate identically to live action? Like, Thrawn is a good example of someone who did do that pretty well, because the guy who plays him in Rebels, the man who voices him, is the same guy who plays him in Ahsoka. And also, the guy who plays Ezra Bridger is, I don't know if there could have been a better casting on Earth. He is phenomenal. And part of that is the writing and the fact that Dave Filoni wrote this character in Rebels and in this show, but another part of that is the actor who's playing him and who is matching his mannerisms and doing a fantastic job overall. Hats off to him. But I just wanted to say, I think Rosario has done a great job in this show, in the Book of Boba Fett, in Mandalorian. I think this is a great representation of what this character is supposed to be at this point in her life. I've also seen people criticizing Ahsoka's skill and her power in this show, saying that she should be a lot more powerful and formidable than she is. And I don't really understand that criticism because, correct me if I'm wrong, but I only recall Ahsoka losing one time in this entire series. Like, she has the brief run-in with Marok, or Merrick, Marok I think is his name, that's how you say it. And he gets away from her, but then they meet up like the next episode and Ahsoka easily kills him. She loses to Baylan Skoll once, they have a draw in the next time, and we can talk about Baylan's power in a minute, but Ahsoka loses to Baylan Skoll one time. She beats Marok. She beats Morgan Elsbeth. She overpowers Shin. Am I missing something? Because from what I saw, Ahsoka was pretty darn formidable in this series. So I don't really get that. But let's talk about Baylan's power for a minute, because that's another thing that I'm a little bit curious about, and I know some people are very interested in finding out more about. How powerful is Baylan Skoll really? Well, we know that this is a character that is older than Ahsoka Tano, who was a Jedi for longer than Ahsoka Tano was most likely. And so he's very experienced and clearly quite powerful, because not only does he defeat Ahsoka in their first encounter, he also says in their second encounter, "You can't defeat me," and Ahsoka doesn't dispute that. She says, maybe I can't defeat you. So, how powerful is this character? Clearly quite powerful, but again, I'm interested in learning more about his backstory and finding out maybe if he had some previous experience with some characters we know. Obviously, he knew Anakin Skywalker. He tells Ahsoka that Anakin spoke highly of her, but did this guy maybe know Count Dooku, Qui-Gon, Obi-Wan? I'm interested to know who his master was. There's a good chance that it's someone we don't even know, but I just want to know more about Baylan Skoll. I think he's interesting. I think Ray Stevenson did a stellar job of portraying this character. And so, again, I want to know more about him. But going back to Ahsoka, we have the lesson between her and Anakin in the world between worlds. And the first time I watched this, I was watching it with my brother, and I looked at him and I was like, I have no idea what's going on right now, but this is amazing. Because obviously, I've seen Rebels, and I knew what the World Between Worlds was, and I knew she was there, and obviously I'm quite familiar with this story, but obviously the World Between Worlds was portrayed a little bit differently here than it was in Rebels, first of all, and second of all, I was just really curious to know how Ahsoka got into the World Between Worlds in the first place, and I still don't think we have an answer to that. I think the implication, and what most people are assuming, is that Anakin saved Ahsoka, and that's how she ended up there. And that's probably the case. Honestly, that's something that I'm not really a big fan of. It is what it is, it's cool, whatever. But I kind of would have preferred Ahsoka just making her way to the World Between Worlds again, and then Anakin teaching the lesson that he wanted to teach her. It would have been a little bit different, obviously, because he was giving her the choice to live or die after she pretty much did die after losing to Baylan. So it would have been a little bit different, but they could have pulled that off in a similar fashion. I don't know, I just wish it had been maybe explained a little bit more, maybe shown to us a little more visually how exactly Ahsoka got into the World Between Worlds. But, it's whatever. It's not like a big thing that I'm dwelling on or anything. It is what it is, like I said. But once we're in the World Between Worlds, the lesson that Anakin teaches Ahsoka and the manner in which he does it is so awesome. It was so cool to see flashbacks from the Clone Wars. It was awesome to see Anakin flicker between Vader and Anakin. And it was cool to see Anakin and Ahsoka clash in a lightsaber duel. How awesome. And also, the younger girl, I can't think of her name, but the one who plays young Ahsoka, the 13 and 17-year-old her in the World Between Worlds, she did an awesome job as well. Pretty much everybody in this show did a great job, but shout out to her because she was great. But the use of Anakin in this series was very well placed in the World Between Worlds, in the recordings of the lessons that he had taught her, that he had recorded for Ahsoka during the Clone Wars, and with him watching over her as a Force ghost in the finale, letting her know that this is where you're supposed to be. The handling of Anakin Skywalker in this series was superb, in my opinion. Also, we had Huyang. Awesome character. Love this guy. Great comedic relief. Also capable of being serious and educational and supportive for the characters. Nothing negative to say about Huyang. Great addition to the cast. Great sidekick for Ahsoka, and I look forward to seeing more of him in the future. Sabine Wren. This was the character that I was probably most interested in coming into this series. I love Sabine in Rebels, and I thought this was a good translation. This was a good live-action representation of that character, but she also underwent some serious changes in this series. Apparently, Sabine was trained by Ahsoka in the past. We knew that Sabine had history with Ahsoka, and we knew that at the end of Rebels she went off with Ahsoka to look for Ezra, but I don't think many of us assumed that Sabine Wren was ever going to become a Jedi. But apparently she did, and there are still some questions about what happened in the past. I'm very curious why Baylan said that Ahsoka not trusting Sabine led to her family dying on Mandalore. I don't really think we got an answer to that. Hopefully that's addressed at some time later on. But Sabine was trained by Ahsoka. Ahsoka sort of gave up on her and walked away. And in this series, she picks Sabine's training back up. And eventually, after a long and painful journey, Sabine finally feels the Force. She connects to it and she's able to use it. Now, what are my thoughts on that? Well, again, in no way did I ever see Sabine becoming a Jedi as a legit possibility. I never really even entertained it. But I will say that, first of all, this is not like some change that goes against what George Lucas had intended with the Force and that Disney changed. The Force has always been something that lived in everybody and everything around the Star Wars universe. It's just that, as Ahsoka says in this series, talent is a major factor. Anakin Skywalker, we know, had the highest midichlorian count of all time, and so using the Force came very easy to him. Most Jedi and Sith have far more midichlorians in them than other Star Wars characters who can't really feel the Force, and depending on how high that concentration is, they may begin to show signs of that without any training at all. Owen mentioned something like that to Obi-Wan in the Kenobi series about Luke. We see that happen with characters like Rey, Ezra, Ahsoka, Anakin. These characters all have high concentrations of midichlorians, and so they are good candidates to be trained as Jedi. Sabine has a much lower midichlorian count, presumably, and not a very strong natural connection to the Force, but she can still use the Force if she works hard enough at it. Now, let's compare this to something in the real world, because it's really no different. Take, for example, a basketball player. Kevin Durant. The dude is 6'10" on a bad day with a 7'6" wingspan. The chances of him becoming a professional basketball player are astronomically higher than someone like Isaiah Thomas, who's 5'8", 5'9", and a smaller, stockier guy who's going to have a much harder time competing against guys who are much taller than him. Genetically, Kevin Durant is much more likely to go to the NBA than Isaiah Thomas is, and he's much more likely to be a better basketball player than Isaiah Thomas is because he's taller, he's lankier, he's built to be a basketball player. Now, this isn't taking anything away from Kevin Durant. They both work extremely hard. But the point is that while one guy had much more potential, they both got there because they both worked excessively hard. Kevin Durant is a better basketball player than Isaiah Thomas is. His potential was way higher than Isaiah Thomas was. Let's say they both reached 90% of their potential. Well, 90% of Kevin Durant's potential is significantly greater than what 90% of Isaiah Thomas's potential would look like. Now let's take that into Star Wars again. Compare Anakin Skywalker to Sabine Wren. Guess what? If Sabine Wren reached 100% of her potential to use the Force, that would probably look like about 30% of Anakin's full potential in the Force. So, assuming they both reached their max potential, which I'm not going to assume that either one of them did, Anakin didn't, obviously, but if they did, Anakin would be much greater than Sabine, but that does not mean that Sabine can't learn to use the Force. The ability to do it is still there. Her talent is just lesser than Anakin's. There's a quote out there that goes something like, hard work beats talent when talent fails to work hard, right? Like, yeah, some people are genetically predispositioned to be better at some things than other people, or than most people. And that's the way it is, and that's the way it works in Star Wars too. Anakin, Ben Solo, Mace Windu, Yoda, Obi-Wan, Darth Sidious. These are all characters who are exceptionally gifted and worked very hard throughout their lives to mold that potential. But then look at someone like Leia. She didn't pursue that path nearly as strongly as the other characters did, and so she didn't reach the heights that they got to. Now we look at Sabine, and I'm not trying to say that Sabine is going to be like some super weak character no matter what she does. Don't take this the wrong way. I'm saying that Sabine is capable of great things, but she has to believe in herself and she has to work exceptionally hard, harder than these other characters would have to, because she is not as gifted as them. But if she puts in the work and the time and the effort and she has the patience, then she can become a true high-functioning Jedi. Now, if we compare her to the upper echelon of Force users, like Anakin and Yoda and Luke, then yeah, she's probably not capable of ever getting to that level, and that's okay. She doesn't have to. Most Jedi don't get to that level, or anywhere close to it, and that's okay. My point is that Sabine learning to use the Force is not something that's out of the ordinary and something that would have been impossible before Disney bought Lucasfilm and started making Star Wars stories. This is how George Lucas viewed the Force as well. Everybody can use the Force. Some people are more naturally adept to learn to use it than others. Now, in terms of how I felt about that direction for Sabine, when I first started seeing them build to it, I wasn't really a fan of it. I kind of thought, she's probably going to end up using the Force. Her story's probably going to go down this Jedi path now. But I kind of hope it doesn't still. I kind of hope they just go with the story that, hey, you don't have to be able to use the Force to be a hero. But we pretty much knew it was going to go that way pretty early on in this series, and it did, and I'm okay with it. It's probably not the path that I would have chosen for her, but I think it's cool. I think it works. I think it sends a good message for people. Hey, you may not be as gifted as the next guy, but if you believe in yourself and you work hard enough, you too can do what they have done. I think it's a good story, and I'm cool with it. I've always liked the character of Sabine, and I have no problem with her learning how to use the Force and becoming a Jedi, and I think it's really cool that she's actually become this character who is like the heir apparent to Tar Vizsla, the first and last Mandalorian Jedi to ever exist. I think it's cool that Sabine is now a Mandalorian Jedi. I think it's really awesome to see a Mandalorian dressed in Mandalorian armor wielding a lightsaber and using the Force. Like, that's so cool. Some of us, including myself, had speculated that maybe Grogu would be that character, and he still could be, but Sabine is next up, and I'm cool with that. I think it's awesome. If we go back to earlier in the series, when Sabine has her run-in with Shin Hati and Shin stabs her through the stomach, listen, I made a video on this before where we talked about all the different characters who have been stabbed and survived. I'm not a fan of them doing this. I get that it's not a big deal, and like the location of the stab matters, and yeah, we can get into all the details, but I do wish they had done something else. Cut off a leg, cut off a hand, have her get skinned on the shoulder or something. I'm not a fan of people continuing to get stabbed straight through the torso and then being okay. We've seen it with Reva, we've seen it with the Grand Inquisitor, we've seen it with Sabine. It is what it is. I don't really care that much, but I hope we don't continue to make a thing out of this in the future, but I mean, whatever. My overall thoughts on Sabine in this series are very positive. The actress did a great job. Filoni and the writers did a great job. Well done, Sabine. I'm looking forward to seeing more of you in the future. Hera, once again, I've said this about pretty much every character to this point, and I think it about every character I'm going to cover from this point forward, but this was a perfect casting. The actress did a wonderful job. I loved watching Hera in this show. I really enjoyed watching her raise Jacen. I loved Jacen's role, especially in episode 5, with how he really drove that story forward and helped them to find Ahsoka. Again, we got a little flash of Hera being able to connect with the Force with Jacen's help. Again, an example of non-Jedi are able to use the Force, and that's okay, and that's how it's always been. We just haven't gotten to see too much of that, but it's always been implied. I'm very interested to see how they handle Jacen's future in terms of whether he will become a Jedi or not. If he does go down that path, there are obviously a few options for who could be his master. Sabine, Ahsoka, Luke Skywalker, Ezra. I do think that the return of Ezra Bridger to the main galaxy pretty strongly implies that if Jacen does undergo some Jedi training, Ezra will be the one to teach him. But there's also a lot of question marks still about how Ezra's story is going to overlap with Luke Skywalker's and eventually avoid Luke Skywalker's story when the collapse of his Jedi Order takes place. But sticking with Ezra, the reunion between Ezra and Sabine was awesome. I think Ezra not taking his lightsaber and choosing to rely on the Force was very fitting for his character. It was really cool to see him rely solely on the Force to guide himself. I liked that callback to Kanan from Huyang when Ezra's building his new lightsaber, where Huyang talks about how he kept an extra part that Kanan used for his saber and then he gives it to Ezra to build his. That was cool. Watching Ezra and Sabine and Ahsoka team up and all three of them wield lightsabers, also very cool. Really looking forward to seeing what they do with Ezra in the future. Despite his limited role in this series, he is definitely in competition for my favorite character of the show. Really well done. Phenomenal casting. Can't wait to see more. I've seen some people speculating that there might be a potential romance between Sabine and Ezra. I do think that you sort of get that feeling, but I also think that Filoni may have gone out of his way to say, hey, we are not going down that road. In Ezra's recording for Sabine, this wasn't something that we saw in Rebels, but in the Ahsoka series, he says that Sabine has always been like a sister to him. That sort of implies that we're not going to get a romance. There's definitely some romantic chemistry there when they re-meet on Peridea, I think. But, romance seems to be fleeting in Star Wars, especially as of late. So I definitely wouldn't put my money on it, but we'll see, never say never. Grand Admiral Thrawn. Again, really liked how they allowed the Rebels actor to play the character in live action. He's obviously a perfect translation from animation to live action. He's right in character. He's exactly how we remembered him. And obviously, I think we're all very interested to see what he does on Dathomir and how his plans eventually tie in with what we saw in The Mandalorian with the Shadow Council talking about his return, and eventually how all of this circles back and connects with the plans of Darth Sidious and Supreme Leader Snoke. I do anticipate that at some point we are going to see Snoke appear in this story, and that's really going to kick things into gear and start pushing us toward the rise of the First Order, which is something that I'm really interested to see, even though I do anticipate that that's some ways down the road still. So, again, overall thoughts on the show. Ahsoka was very entertaining. There were really great lightsaber duels across the board. It's really cool to see how whenever we have duels between characters who were around during the prequel trilogy, during the Clone Wars, when the Jedi were really putting a big, strong emphasis on lightsaber combat. It's cool to see how characters from that era continue to fight in the way that they did back then. They're very fast-paced. They make very quick and calculated moves and counter moves against each other, and I think that's really cool to see. Again, great castings across the board. Hera, Ezra, Sabine, Ahsoka, Baylan Skoll, Shin Hati, Jacen Syndulla, Thrawn. They were all fantastic. The big looming question now is just, will we see this story continued in Season 2 of Ahsoka, or will we not get a Season 2 and we will have to wait till the Filoni movie, or is there a third option? Maybe the story will be picked up and continued in The Mandalorian Season 4. I do think that we'll probably touch on these characters a little bit in that series. I definitely expect Thrawn's name to at least be mentioned. He could show up. I would probably say that's decently likely that Thrawn will appear in Season 4 of The Mandalorian. We could see Ezra Bridger. We could see the return of Luke Skywalker. We could see Leia. Also, as a side note, I loved the mention of Leia in episode 7, was that? I think it was episode 7. That was really cool. Nice to see. But that is going to wrap things up for me. Ahsoka was very good. I don't know if I would say it was my favorite live-action Disney Plus show. It's in the running. It might be my favorite. I don't know, I haven't thought about that too much, but I really enjoyed it. But that is going to wrap things up for me in this video, so let me know what you guys thought about Ahsoka in the comments section below. Let me know what you're hoping to see in the future. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to drop a like to support the channel. Subscribe to the channel if you are new, and remember, the Force will be with you always.